Gallery photos, and this is the panel on investing in behavioral health. So we'll start off with doing introductions of our panel, and I want to thank everybody for being here at the last panel of the day right before cocktail hour, and so we'll try to keep it lively and interesting for everybody. Sarah, would you like to go first?
Absolutely. Sarah Sasson, principal with Flair Capital based in Boston. So we invest in health tech and tech-enabled services. We are just beginning to make investments out of our second fund, which is about in the $2 million range. We invest anywhere from $3 to $6 million. It's an initial check, but we're life cycle investors, so we're holding on to anywhere from 15 to 25 million over the life cycle of the company, stage agnostic. But I'm relatively new to venture. I came from 15 years in the health systems and payer space, so was actually out here for 11 years. Did my master's work at Berkeley, was at Kaiser Permanente, I was down in San Diego in the US Navy, and in all those places I helped launch innovation initiatives to help launch Kaiser's first large-scale telemedicine digital program in 2008. So the last 6 years I've spent at Mass General and Partners helping, again, launch and create digital health programs. So after many years of lobbying for reimbursement, regulatory change, and implementing and executing, I was excited to look beyond the walls of the hospitals that I worked for. So made the shift to venture. So very similar space, but just a different role. So excited to be here. Thank you guys for sticking it out with us. Great. Shubhra.
Hi, my name is Shubhra. I lead the healthcare practice at a venture fund here in San Francisco called Coda Capital. Coda is a $300 million fund. We're stage agnostic, and on the healthcare side, we invest in all things tech except drugs and services. So as long as it has a technology element to it, so that includes devices, life science tools, diagnostics, all of digital health. My personal background before Coda, I'm a physician by background. I trained as a primary care physician, did a program called Biodesign at Stanford, did my MBA at Wharton, and led product for a digital health startup before joining Coda, and now do healthcare investments for us.
Stephen?
My name is Stephen Carney. I'm also a medical doctor. I'm with Hanover Re. So Hanover Re is a reinsurance company. Not an industry that most people are overly familiar with. Our clients are insurance companies, so we're basically B2B insurance, because capital is fairly commoditized over the last few years. Basically, we've always provided services on top of the simple insurance solutions that we provide to whether it's health insurance companies or life insurance companies. But more and more, we're seeing the emergence of digital health into mainstream health and life insurance policies. For example, you might know the Vitality Active, the smartwatch that comes with some insurance policies. So we're the global reinsurance partner for that, and if insurance companies offer that, we might be the actual risk carrier for that bet, that the more you move, the cheaper your policy should be. I can talk more about our business as the panel goes on. I'm also some background in masters in computer science and some background in data analytics. I'm trained as a urologist.
And my name is Valerie Photos. I am from IASO Ventures. It's the first fund in America focused on behavioral health. So we invest in all sort of areas except for therapeutics, much like the rest of the panel here. We are new and we have a $50 million fund, and we're just sort of getting started on the scene. So I wanted to start off the panel by giving a very broad definition of behavioral health, because I'm aware that there's a little bit of a Tower of Babel problem here. As I've been going around the rest of JPM, I've been hearing lots of different terms used for this area of healthcare. We define behavioral health as 3 generic parts: psychiatry, neurology, and addiction. So psychiatry includes the 600 or so mental disorders that are in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Science that we use in psychiatry. There are some examples are things like ADHD, autism, depression, schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, OCD, anxiety disorders. The second area is neurology. There's also about 600 disorders there. It's disorders of the brain, spine, and the nerves that connect them. Some common disorders in this area are Alzheimer's disease, Parkinson's, epilepsy, sleep and pain disorders. And then the third area that I consider a part of behavioral health is addiction, which are substance use disorders. The most common of those are alcohol use disorders and opiate addiction, both of which are really important problems, as you guys all know right now. This sector of behavioral health is distinct from the sector of health and wellness interventions. So health and wellness interventions generically target well populations, people that aren't patients, and they aim to increase fitness, nutrition, diet, general health. But what they don't have are clinical trials or evidence published in peer-reviewed journals for specific patient populations, or they don't have kind of a scientific program that targets a specific type of person. And then finally, behavioral health is also distinct from behavioral medicine. Behavioral medicine is generally interventions that are aimed at chronic health conditions like diabetes or heart disease, where those interventions are aimed at supporting the symptoms or the compliance with the medical treatments. So hopefully that helps everybody in the room understand the kinds of interventions that we're all looking at. And then I want to start off then with the panel. So the tagline of this particular panel is that the behavioral health sector has been commonly misunderstood. So specifically in relationship to the investing and funding of companies, what would you all say has been commonly misunderstood about this sector, and what's changing so that we can have this panel today now? Shubhra, would you like to start, please?
Sure. So I think one thing that is commonly misunderstood is what you just described. I think the first starting point that is commonly misunderstood is what is behavioral health and what is included in that definition. And I don't think there is actually one clear definition. Everyone puts their own boundaries around it. So I think there's no standardized understanding in the United States of what is included in behavioral health. The second aspect that has been traditionally misunderstood is it is a category, a classification of care or medicine rather than, and is viewed typically as a services business. It's only in recent years that we're seeing some technology plays in behavioral health in terms of startups, and hence the understanding of most investors when they use the term behavioral health or hear the term behavioral health is it's a services company, which necessarily may not be the case today. I'm seeing a lot of technological plays and startups in behavioral health, so I think that has fundamentally definitely changed.
If I could add on to that too, my husband's a psychiatrist, so having been on the journey between medical school and residency for 10 years, I think he was very upset when our pediatrician joked with him and said, "Oh, so now that you're starting your psychiatry residency, you put your stethoscope away." You know, it is a very, I think there's a lot of intersection between neurology and psychiatry, and so I think there's this misperception, and I think there's also that so often psychiatry and behavioral health is comorbid with other conditions, so it's very hard to separate out how is an intervention impacting not just behavioral health, but those other areas. So I think that's one of the things impacting our ability to show the ROI. You know, it's hard enough to show the ROI of a tech and service implementation separate from you know, the rest of the things happening in the system, much less comorbid piece. I would say the other thing too, just to continue on what are been the challenges, is the reimbursement side of things. I think you know, as I look at what's happening in the behavioral health space and in digital health, you know, I've done the most work in behavioral health, so video visits are really natural. Behavioral health suits themselves very well to that. We've done at Mass General and Partners thousands and thousands and thousands across every clinical subspecialty of psychiatry, and I think that's a great opportunity, but in many ways it's only replicating the in-person experience. So you're substituting in-person FaceTime for video FaceTime, which does solve many problems of access. I have lots of stories I can share about, you know, the patients actually sharing more about their substance use through the video. So there are many benefits, but it's not solving the fundamental problem of access. And at this point, reimbursement really is, for the most part, only reimbursing for video. So there are many other types of psychiatry and behavioral health interventions happening in asynchronous modalities, so things we call e-consults, e-visits. Project Echo is something out of New Mexico, which actually trains physicians. So one example is autism. There are very few autism providers, but this allows provider-to-provider training within particular clinical specialties. So there are many different possibilities. I think we're seeing more digital therapeutics, trying to identify and support behavioral health. But I think the challenge is ultimately right now only video is being reimbursed. So how do you get engagement when it's not being paid for?
And in order to add to that, I think one of the biggest use cases that has come up in the last only couple of years is chatbots. Mental health and behavioral health is one of the most successful areas for chatbots in healthcare. Robot and a couple of other companies are seeing phenomenally high engagement rates with chatbots as compared to using human coaches at the other end of those conversations. Apparently, people who are suffering from these conditions, there is not as much hesitation to use technology as we have traditionally thought there will be, or limitation of the ability to use technology, and they're engaging very well with these solutions. To your point, if you could find a way to monetize that and to develop a business model around that, that's when it becomes a sustainable and scalable business that investors will actually be very attracted to.
Please speak into the microphones. It's a little bit hard to hear.
Thank you. And Stephen, what about you? What is misunderstood about behavioral health, and what are you seeing changing in this sector?
Look, what struck me when you're sort of talking about the definition of behavioral health, or how to break it down into psychiatry, neurology, and addiction, I think framing it to your audience struck me. So, for example, the organization that I work within, 3,500 people globally. We have about maybe 40 medical doctors working within the organization globally, but half our employees are probably actuaries or mathematicians, and as smart as they are, most of them probably couldn't de-differentiate an issue as to whether it was psychiatry or neurology or an addiction. But if you put a label on it and call it insurtech, all of a sudden they'll sort of get it a bit more, and the whole sort of, there'll be a huge education process. But if you frame it in the language that you're reducing some type of risk for them, and maybe what I can counterbalance on this forum is provide a bit of more international outlook on things. I know the US is very reimbursement focused. It's reimbursement, and absolutely that's a very hugely legitimate problem. But globally, the health systems are so different outside the United States. So if you're talking to investors or partners, we do both. We're both a partner for startups and bigger companies globally, and occasionally invest in things that we think are strategically good for us and our clients. Basically, framing your sell as rather than reimbursement, putting it into risk reduction, which is getting back to that question about behavioral health and the definition of it. It's like one member of the panel spoke on the last time, really know who you're speaking to, so if you're speaking to Valerie's fund, absolutely. But if you're speaking to us, maybe if your initial pitch is more focused on risk reduction and the insurtech angle and reducing our clients' costs.
Very good. And in the spirit of trying to do some education, I thought maybe we could each take a moment to talk a little bit about a particular company that we're familiar with within this sector, and describe a little bit about what the business model is and how it's a really good investment for some of the people in the room.
Sure. So I can talk about one of the companies that I'm a fan of is a company called Orchid Health, and they are broadly fall into the category of addiction, and they're essentially a platform for all kinds of addiction. And it's a web platform and an app platform for all kinds of addiction. They're doing a lot of coaching and are incorporating some elements of technology in order to make it scalable and make the unit economics work on the business side of things. The things that are great about the business, one is I really like the platform approach versus point solutions. So instead of saying this is a solution for drinking, this is a solution for smoking, they're saying behaviorally what causes addiction is the same phenomenon. Why do you want to go back to this XYZ thing, whether that is drinking or smoking or something else? And hence, if we know the principles around that, and if our coaches are trained to coach and counsel around that, then we can really use it as a platform irrespective of what the specific problem is. So I really like that platform approach versus point solutions. It becomes important from a sales and distribution perspective, because when you're going and selling to, for example, self-insured employers or health plans, they don't want to engage. It's a lot of overhead and burden on them to pick the best solution for drinking, to pick the best solution for smoking, and individually engage with all of these different platforms, and before they know it, they have 100 different solutions being offered to their employee population or patient population. So if you can have a platform approach like that, that really makes the distribution and the BD process a lot easier for the business. The second thing that I really like about the business is the use of technology. So a lot of plays in coaching are using human coaches at the other end of the spectrum, and again, to your earlier point, video visits are still visits, and hence your time and your ability to do them is limited by the number of people you can hire, and the economics of the business are limited by, the margins are limited by the salary you're paying those people. So if there's lower hanging fruit, whether that is screening patients, guiding them to appropriate resources, helping find the right level of care for them, and if you can automate some of that and use AI and chatbots or whatnot to do that, then that really takes a lot of overhead out of the process, and you can choose to escalate people who really need that human element of care, or at least at the point when they need it, to that level. And hence the economics and the scalability of the business looks much better from an investor perspective. Orchid Health. Full disclosure, I'm not an investor in the company or in any way involved with the company. I just like their model.
Yeah, and I also really like their model as well. I mean, we were recently involved in some of the discussions in Massachusetts about the opioid epidemic, and the task force has come back and said that the main intervention that we like to see happening there are the assignment of recovery coaches to people who are entering the system for recent opiate addiction, heroin overdosing. The problem is that 1 in 27 people in Massachusetts have this problem, and so if we're going to be assigning recovery coaches to all of these people, we have to have a system to train the recovery coaches, to certify them, to make sure that they're continuing to provide excellent care, and that just is a simply unsolvable, unscalable problem for us. And so with the advent of this kind of technology, we're able to go to the state of Massachusetts and say, great, we can implement what you're asking us to do, but we can do it in a way that will happen in the next year, not in the next 15 years, at which point we'll already have a new drug that people are interested in using too much of, and it'll be all for naught in terms of our training systems. So I agree, this kind of technology is also bringing us closer to actually solving the health problems that are on the ground today. Other companies, Sarah and Steven, that you've been familiar with that might help everybody in the room understand the kinds of companies that are here.
I think having come from an enterprise where we did not want 100 different solutions, our leadership was very biased against doing anything that wasn't Epic. So we had to make the case that something was going to be a multi-specialty platform. I think psychiatry and behavioral health was oftentimes the best use case, and they were close partners in implementing. I'll give a couple examples in that space. So actually this morning I was meeting with a company called eVisit, but we did something very similar at MGH, where Michigan, for example, has a law that requires that anyone that's been prescribed a controlled substance now needs to have a follow-up visit within a certain period of time, but they do allow for that to be an asynchronous online video as well, and they're paying for this video or just asynchronous interaction. So this eVisit, the company is called eVisit. They're using the platform across the state to actually provide follow-up visits. I think they said it was only a $60,000 implementation, but they've already shown that they've already collected $600,000 revenue from these visits. So I think there's a real opportunity in some of the follow-up care that happens around medication management and chronic diseases, where it takes time, but what you actually need the time for is the high acuity patients. I'd say the other thing too is, as I mentioned, video visits. Again, it's applicable applicable across every area, every clinical area virtually, but companies like American Well are now carving out a behavioral health division, and so they now have a team of psychiatrists. They are doing this both in terms of initial care and ongoing care. And I think it's interesting. I think the pushback from the health system perspective is that this isn't integrated in terms of the rest of their care. I think one of the surprising things we found is there are times where patients really didn't want that psychiatric or that behavioral health concern noted in their medical records. So I think sometimes these companies, the fact that it does have a separate EMR is an opportunity for people to share in a safer space. I think the other thing we've seen with video visits is, likewise, I was saying that the patients would oftentimes feel comfortable sharing things that they wouldn't necessarily share in person. So if I was a teenager, we were using this a lot for substance abuse. So very often that 15-year-old wouldn't want to admit that they drank or used in the last week, but if they're doing it over video, there's something that's safer about sitting in their bed sharing it over a screen. So, and I think likewise it also gave the provider insight into the home. Were there dogs barking, kids screaming, was there messy, what was the home environment, which really gave them insights to thinking about how to treat them. So I think there are a lot of different opportunities, those are just a couple examples.
I like your example because it demonstrates something really important about the investor side of this, which is that when many of our investment teams have doctors and physicians on our teams, so we're able to see some of the red flags in some of the business models. And so you're talking about the hurdles that somebody might not otherwise see if they're developing a product, and we're able to kind of foresee that and overcome it.
One of the companies we've partnered with and subsequently invested in is called Kinematics. So it's a posture scanning software. I believe the hardware they use is off-the-shelf Microsoft Kinect and packaged in their own proprietary hardware where you don't really realize it's a Kinect underneath. But essentially, when it comes to disability claims and also underwriting people with musculoskeletal disorders, basically, what we want to offer is a platform that's very scalable globally, that people within our organization can understand without a huge amount of basically background education. They don't have time to be pitched or whatever. What we tend to do is trial these things internally on ourselves. So we have kinematic hardware and software, doing a roadshow around all our offices globally, and all the staff got to play with it. Same with connected health devices like Vitality. We're partnered with about 4 different connected health companies. Actually more when I think about it, 4 different companies on the software side. So Dakadu, Vitality, and Garmin, Fitbit. So we encourage our employees to try these services out, download the software onto their smartphones, play with it, give feedback, but it has to be very customizable for our clients. So what we would say would be ideally, like Shubra said, a platform that is sort of quite broad, that is not very niche in just pigeonholed into 1 or 2 solutions, but have a broad technology portfolio. And then when it comes to insurance globally, the regulations are hugely niche. Even in the United States, on a state-by-state basis, you wouldn't believe what the difficulties in just trialing things in the United States. We tend not to try and trial things in the United States because of the differences between individual states, and then dealing with federal regulations on top of that. We'll try them in a sort of an emerging market of 50 million people, maybe South Africa, Southeast Asia, Malaysia is a great spot for us to test these products. And then if we get a bit of traction with a client and we can show some marketing material, then we can port it over to the United States. So that's what happened with Vitality, for example. Grew out of South Africa, got a lot of traction in Southeast Asia, and then was it Lincoln that announced recently? A large US life insurance company recently said that they wouldn't be selling you life insurance without an connected health device. So a bit controversial, but an interesting play. A little bit like Apple removing the USB ports from their machine, you know. But, yeah.
Well, shifting gears a little bit, I want to talk a little bit about how investors might understand how your firm works with behavioral health companies and how you source your deals and what you might want to see from companies that approach you in terms of their team, in terms of their expertise, in terms of all the variety of things that people come to you with. Stephen, you can go.
How we work, basically it's, we've gotten a lot more efficient with how we work with startups and new investment proposals in the last year, I would even say. So I've been with Hanover Re for 2.5 years. Before that it was just potluck, whether you got traction internally. There was no, from what I could see, properly managed internal deal flow mechanism, whether it was by person or by software. And we have a very software-driven approach with regards to deals that are screened initially, where we have engagement managers that will screen something and progress it to the right person within the organization. We have an essential, one thing I would say is there's a little bit of tension between the local branches and subsidiaries and the central headquarters. I guess everyone in this room is probably quite US focused, so we do have individual, a couple of partnership managers in the United States that tend to manage all our US partnerships and investments, and they're probably still the best people to deal with. If you're curious about dealing with things globally, again, you will be fed with, even if you're talking to an actuary or anyone within the organization, it's become a lot more efficient with regards to how you'll actually get implemented. And then what we've actually developed is an app store for our clients. So not publicly accessible, but our clients, which is about 2,500 insurance companies globally, can see various opportunities, startups to larger, more significant companies that we've partnered with, that we offer insurance solutions around. And yeah, I'm happy to talk more about how that works offline as well.
Yeah, so I think when I look at a behavioral health opportunity, the first thing I look at is this is generally true, founder and the founding team. And there are things that I look for over there, which is how deeply do they really understand the issues in the behavioral health space, and do they really get the nuances of it? The stigma, the difficulty with getting engagement from these patients, the different business models, reimbursement or paying out of pocket, if the patient is paying out of pocket, then the ability and willingness to pay the right pricing model for them. And then also the follow-up piece that you mentioned. There are a lot of sort of one and done solutions, and it's very hard to actually drive a change in outcomes if you're one of those, and then how do you actually claim attribution to outcomes? So at a very basic level, even if they don't have the product all built out, does the founder really understand these nuances as they're building the product? The second thing that I feel I say no to for most behavioral investments on is the business model. It's a very, very difficult space for having a scalable business model with high margins and the kind of growth that a venture investor wants to see. So an average VC is looking for a 10x return in 3 to 5 years. And it's very difficult for you to build that unless you have some fundamental technology integrated into the business that scales really fast. If it's primarily people/services dependent, it's going to be really hard to scale that quickly. So I think that's the second big thing that I look for in the mental health businesses.
And we're the same at IASA Ventures, and so we really look for teams to be able to understand the specific patient populations they're working with and the types of symptoms that they bring to the table that may make it difficult for them to actually use the product. that they've thought those through and that they've consulted with enough people to solve those problems. And I think when companies are coming to us, because we specialize in behavioral health, we know that they're looking for a more robust investment team to kind of take on some of those business problems with them.
And maybe I won't repeat the things that you guys have covered most of the bases. I think, again, on the business model side, I think it is challenging. I think, how many of you are in the entrepreneur startup space? Okay, it's business. So you can tell us what you're finding, but I think very often the groups that we're finding that are most excited about the space are self-insured employers and integrated payer provider systems that are having to they're really feeling the cost of not taking care of behavioral health problems, or they're losing their patients outside of the system and then paying a much higher price because of that. So I think where you can tackle or find people that that's a good fit for. I think the other thing is Flair looks at companies. We have a very strategic LP base, so we likewise go out and get people to invest in us, and then we're investing in startups. And our LP base is a mix of providers like PMC, Cleveland Clinic, Boston Children's Hospital, payers, Humana, Centene. We also have Pharma as part of the new fund that we're just about to launch from, and we also have industry folks like CVS and Walgreens. So one of the things that we do is we go to our payers and to our providers and say, is this something you would actually do? And importantly, how much would you be willing to pay for it? And I think that's often where we get stuck is, yes, this is interesting, but it's hard to know how much that they would pay for it. So that's oftentimes where we've gotten stuck with some of the behavioral health things that we've looked at. The last thing I would say is, two more things. One, we have Gary Gottlieb, who's the former CEO of Partners Healthcare, is also a psychiatrist, and he's one of our executive partners, so he gets really involved in talking with the founder and the team. And then last thing, I think just having come from a place where I knew that you could have an absolutely fabulous platform and program and great user experience and design, but if providers don't want to use it, it doesn't matter. So I think ultimately I'll always ask the question, we're investing in things where even at the seed level, you need to have some sort of customer base and revenue and adoption and volume. And if people often brush off the question of how many visits are you doing, even the American Well is out there because it just hasn't been huge adoption. So I think just showing that you have gotten providers engaged, even if it's the champions, but how much are your high utilizers doing this is really key.
I probably should just add a little bit about, I spoke more about the mechanism of getting in the door, but once you're in the door, probably it's a two-stage process. It's partnerships day one and investments day two. Probably team and technology will give you a pass on both when it comes to the partnerships. We've worked with some terrible teams, but if we view the technology as offering us a strategically advantageous product day one, we'll work with it. Vice versa, we've taken things and trialed things internally, and as I said, we like to test it on employees. We'll find out soon enough if your technology is terrible, but so, and I know that's how our competitors work as well. Even if you're pre-revenue or whatever, we'll take a gamble on partnering with you on a very small scale and working with a pilot. And then if that works out, then the investment will come.
So we're here today to talk about, digital technology, digital therapeutics, and I would like to hear from people why, specifically in behavioral health, we are all making investments in digital health, digital technology, medical devices, healthcare IT, and why that's something that we're seeing as very good for our investors as opposed to traditional pharmaceuticals.
So I can start on that. I'm a huge fan of digital therapeutics, and I have done a lot of deep dive into that space. I think behavioral health is uniquely positioned to benefit from digital therapeutics. So of all of the depression medications available on the market, only 40% of the population responds to a first-line depression medication. You probably know this. So we don't really understand the physiology and the pharmacology of mental health issues nearly as well as we understand this process of disease in many other areas of physical health issues. And hence, the response to therapeutics and drugs is not nearly as good as in many other disease conditions, which leaves a huge opportunity for us to intervene in other ways to change that outcome. The second reason why I think behavioral health is uniquely positioned to benefit is because a lot of the issues are, in essence, behavioral in nature, right? So, for lack of a better explanation, so much of it is about the social support that you're able to provide to the person who's going through this process and suffering from this process. So much of it is coaching and being able to provide that ecosystem where they can really think in the positive direction, where they can really focus on things that matter, where they can find happiness in the simple pleasures of life, so to say. So I think that is a very, very important element, and given the lack of availability of medications, effective therapeutics to help these patients, it becomes all the more important that biotherapeutic side is at the very least supplemented and supported with a behavioral intervention. And digital therapeutics are a great way of administering behavioral interventions at scale. So that's the third problem it solves, that it solves the services non-scalability portion of the business model. So maybe I should have actually took a second to talk about what digital therapeutic is. So digital therapeutic, the way I think of it, is any solution or intervention that is administered digitally and you can actually demonstrate an attribution to the change of outcome through a rigorous clinical testing process, whether that is a trial or something like that. So it's a little bit of a higher bar on burden of proof than simply a wellness solution, which to your earlier point is a different category. So I think for those reasons, I'm very excited about digital therapeutics and behavioral health, and peer therapeutics has really opened the doors for a lot of digital therapeutic solutions by being the first solution to go through FDA and really be able to demonstrate that burden of proof on changing outcomes through a software. So the days of prescribing software for behavioral health solutions and that becoming a norm are not very far away in my opinion.
I agree with you. And so we know that there's about 120 different antidepressants out there, and coming as a clinical psychologist, that for a long time we've known that cognitive behavioral therapy interventions are as effective as pharmaceutical interventions and actually are much more robust in the long term. And so in order for your antidepressant to continue working, you need to continue taking it. For CBT, if you go through a long enough therapy trial, once you stop the therapy, it will still continue to ameliorate your symptoms, but it's been cost prohibitive. And so now we're able to see companies that are able to say, we can bring this treatment to you, and it can be much more cost effective, as cost effective or better than pharmaceuticals, work longer, and we can really target something that patients are really wanting to use without putting a medication in their body.
So well said, both of you, and I would just add that I think, as you both said, this is about modifying behavior, and one of the challenges I think in behavioral health in particular is that once the patient's feeling well, they oftentimes don't want to take the medication anymore. So I think that using digital technologies, in particular gamification, online social networks, can really be a way to get people engaged, and there's also some reward systems that people are experimenting with. Also, in terms of thinking about, if you're taking a medication, the digital therapeutics, just in terms of tracking and training and explaining and other things, there's a lot of opportunity.
And we're talking about behavior change, but one of the things that's been most compelling for our investors is to know that for most of the behavior therapies that are being digitized right now, it actually results also in biological changes. And so for many of the major mental health conditions, what we see is that if you actually do imaging, you can see changes that are significantly similar to taking a pharmaceutical intervention with behavioral therapies. And so our investors really like to see that these are actually analogous products that can produce the same kinds of results, and that it's changing the biology of the medical process in addition to just changing the behaviors. And I should add too, just as a point of reference, that a lot of the digital therapeutics that we're talking about are complementary to medications as well. And so they can be offered in packages to support the use of pharmaceuticals.
So I guess on the behavioral end of the spectrum, I'm more on the health and wellness side rather than on the psychiatry and neurology side, or at least we haven't gotten into that as in depth. But for example, I think from our perspective, we will do a lot of R&D when it comes to the actual outcomes of any product that we would implement, because we would actually probably want to share risk on that, or use it as when we're trying to sell it to our clients, what we're selling is basically decreased costs or increased revenue. So we would put an actuary or two onto it, and that's our equivalent of, I guess, FDA clearance, that when we speak to our clients globally, that they won't want to know about randomized control trials or CE marks or FDA marks. It's funny, I was told to stop talking about randomized control trials or to this medical or scientific evidence for a product actually working. Unfortunately, or the way it works, at least for ourselves, it's bottom line. Are we reducing costs, or are we increasing revenues? And obviously, we would have a medical person within the local branch or a subsidiary that would make sure that something is not snake oil and that it has the appropriate regulatory approvals, etc. But what we're really looking for is sort of dollars.
Yeah, and I'll underline that too, which is that I think an important part of behavioral health is that it's, many people know that depression is the #1 global disease of burden here. And many of the products that we look at too are actually, really targeting getting back to work, getting functional, getting back to school, all of the things that bring people back into the workforce and earning money for everybody. So I think we'll stop here and ask for questions from the audience. Does anybody have anything they'd like to ask? Yes.
Yeah, so we are in the space where we're building technology for behavioral health. One of the challenges we are finding is on the mild to moderate side, you can work with the technology, it works great. When you start moving the spectrum of severely mental health or more complex care patients are pre-utilizing. There is not just the behavioral health issues, but there are other issues, including addictions, very common, and other chronic diseases that come into play. So when looking at a tool, would it be looking at still from a diagnosis perspective, or looking much broader tools that cover all these areas? For complex care, you need that coverage for all type of diagnosis. So I don't know what your comments are on that.
So that's fine, right? I think as a startup, you have to pick your battles, and that applies in many, many areas, including product and the customer base that you choose to actually serve. If you can serve the mild to moderate population, that in itself is a big enough pool for behavioral health, I think. Now, that said, if you were to look at the more severe, the serious end of the spectrum, there's still a lot that can be done for them through technology. For example, coordination of care, referrals, follow-ups, keeping track of medication. So there's still a lot of different elements of their care that can be solved or at least aided by technology. It may not solve it 100%, and that's what I meant when I was saying you will be able to take away 80% of the pain points with technology, but there'll always be that 20% at the top where you need that human touch. But if you're able to just stratify them appropriately and allocate your resources appropriately, that will make a significant change to your business model, economics, and scalability.
I would say that targeting a population of severe mental illness is one of the ways in which people can shift costs a lot. As you say, severe utilizers are responsible for 85% of the cost of the behavioral healthcare system. And so I know that a lot of the payers that are investors would like to see some solutions that are actually driving those costs down. And so I see companies like that as very attractive because it's the ones that can be most economically viable and create the most impact economically. So we're interested in those for sure.
The problem we see in that space is the payers, especially the Medicaid side. they are not the only delivering care, it's the providers that they work with. So they need to have care plans that are all integrated, and that's a big challenge.
Other questions? Yes.
First of all, it's so wonderful to hear all of you. I've been waiting for one day to have behavioral health being focused, and I took lots and lots of notes from all your suggestions. My question for you is this: since, as you know, not many people, there's a lot of education required at this point to understand what really is behavioral health, what's the impact of it, how we can make a difference, right? So when you look at it from that perspective, and when you're thinking from an entrepreneur's perspective of where you need to show engagement, you need to show outcomes before people will take you seriously, what do you see when you are evaluating companies, whether they are B2C or B2B? Because what I see in my experience in this space, because we are doing symptom management, is you start with B2C, but then as you're able to show value and traction and stickiness, then you can move to B2B. So how do you evaluate that when you're looking at startups?
Well, one thing, I think we have players yet to make a D2C investment. I think sometimes that will come secondarily, but oftentimes it's hard to see a 10x business in a D2C. That may be a way to test and iterate and refine your product initially before going B2B. But I think it depends. But I do think there's so much need out there from consumers. I think you were also getting at what's the opportunity now. And I think one thing just that I wanted to make sure to highlight is, what's different now from an investor standpoint. I think between gun violence and suicides of really prominent people and the opioid epidemic, this is something that's much more socialized than it was 4 or 5 years ago. So that's one piece of it. I think the other thing is, I don't think we have to explain to patients. I don't think we need to explain to people quite as much. Actually, just when I was walking over here, there was a big billboard on Market Street that said, "Online counseling with a licensed therapist has better help. Get happy online and start therapy online." So the fact that this is on a billboard on Market Street in San Francisco is just, it's like my wildest dream from 10 years ago. So this is reality now. So it's something that doesn't require explaining. And the last piece is just the reimbursement. CMS just changed reimbursement where they are now paying for asynchronous. And many payers, even that don't pay for video, are paying full freight of all psychiatry codes just because there is such a need. So I don't think we're entirely there yet, but I think there are a lot of things tipping towards that.
I can add a little bit to that. I think there are very few markets in the US healthcare system where D2C actually works. So I agree with you to a great extent over there. And in my opinion, I found two where it works is pediatrics and pets. So people will pay for their children. So there are markets within behavioral health, like autism or child psychiatry, where you could build a B2C business, in my opinion. I haven't seen a play yet. But there are very few of these niches, and you have to figure out one that works for you. But in general, B2B or B2B2C is the model that we're more commonly seeing. And again, it's good to test out your product with your consumers beforehand, but from a business model perspective, that's what we've seen working so far. In terms of what's new, I agree there's a lot less stigma and more awareness for sure. I think there is also less, the regulatory environment has changed a little bit, especially on the digital therapeutic side. With Peer getting the first FDA approval, there is more, for good and for bad in some ways, because mostly for good, because now investors are expecting and holding startups more accountable, as well as their customers are holding startups more accountable to be able to demonstrate a line of sight to the change in outcomes and demonstrate attribution to outcomes. So the bar is higher than we're a wellness solution and we're just going to do this in a telehealth or digital way. But at the same time, the outcomes are better and there is more trust. If you are able to meet that bar and if you are able to demonstrate that the solution works, then there's more trust from not only healthcare investors but also tech investors. So mental health is not an area that only deep healthcare funds are looking at anymore. I think there are a lot of tech funds that are also looking at that space.
So we're going to have to stop here. I want to thank everybody for joining me on the panel today and everybody for listening. And I can only hope that in a few years when we're back here at Resi, that is no longer something that we have to talk about being kind of outside the margins of mainstream, that we're a panel that's talking just like every other sector of healthcare as a great way for investing and a great way for helping patients.
I'll see you all. And also, hands in the audience for startups and entrepreneurs. I think we're probably all glad to take your cards and share ours. I think we're excited about this space, which is why we're here. So find us. Okay.
Yes, absolutely. Great. Thank you.
Thank you so much.